A letter arrived, yet no one delivered it. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's begin. It was upon a damp and melancholy afternoon in the early autumn of '89 that I found myself once more within the familiar sitting room of Baker Street. The rain, having begun with a delicate drizzle at luncheon, had now descended into a steady sheet, veiling the thoroughfare below in a haze of rippling glass. Holmes, whose capacity for indifference to climate exceeded even that of the most hardened cabman, sat in his customary armchair, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his gaze fixed not upon the window nor upon me, but upon a single folded sheet of paper which lay upon the small table between us. "You observe nothing unusual, Watson?" he inquired suddenly, without shifting his eyes from the document. I confess that I had been content to watch the rain and indulge in idle thought, but I leaned forward to examine the object of his scrutiny. It was an envelope of thick cream paper, unmarked by stamp or postmark, and bearing upon its surface a hand of such refinement that even I could appreciate its elegance. The seal, a curious device of a crowned falcon in scarlet wax, had been broken. "Merely a letter, Holmes," I replied, "though I will allow that it has an uncommon air of formality." Holmes permitted himself one of those thin smiles which so often prefaced some intellectual disclosure. "You are correct, my dear fellow, in identifying it as a letter. Yet would you believe me if I told you that no human hand delivered it?" I laughed. "Surely you jest. Unless you suppose that some mechanical contrivance conveyed it up the stair." "Neither jest nor fancy," said he, leaning forward at last and touching the envelope with a long forefinger. "This letter appeared this morning upon our very table, placed, as you see, with precision, though Mrs. Hudson swears she brought in no correspondence, and no sound nor sight of any visitor was perceived. I must confess that a certain chill, independent of the rain, crept over me as I regarded the thing. Then how in heaven's name— That, Watson, is the matter which we are called upon to unravel. Allow me to read it to you." Holmes unfolded the sheet and read aloud in a deliberate voice. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you are requested, nay, compelled, to attend upon the matter of utmost gravity, which concerns the welfare of a gentleman of high station. You will present yourself at once at the chambers of Sir Edward Markham, Queen Anne's Gate, this very evening, and you will carry with you this letter as proof of your summons. Should you fail, consequences beyond reckoning shall ensue." There was no signature. Holmes laid the paper down and regarded me with a light in his grey eyes which bespoke both amusement and calculation. An unsigned summons delivered by unseen agency and commanding my presence under veiled threat. "Come, Watson, does it not stir the blood?" "It stirs mine, assuredly," I returned, "but it smacks more of melodrama than genuine peril. Can it not be some practical jest?" Holmes shook his head. "Observe the phrasing, the choice of terms. This is no work of a wag. It is composed by a mind both cultivated and urgent." Further the sealed, he lifted the broken fragment of wax. "This falcon with crown is the device of the Markham family, one of the oldest baronetcies in the county of Kent. Our correspondent is at least no impostor. And yet you cannot say who bore it here?" "Precisely. Mrs. Hudson assures me that no knock was heard, nor was any step upon the stair observed. I myself was present in this room during the hour when it must have been delivered, and yet, poof, it was here. A letter brought by no hand, or by one of such extraordinary cunning that it escaped both our landlady's and my own notice." Holmes rose and took his violin from its stand, plucking a string absently. "We must not keep Sir Edward waiting, Watson." Adventure beckons. I could not repress a smile at his eagerness, for though the rain continued to lash against the panes, and the air without was raw with damp, Holmes displayed that quickening of spirit which the scent of a new puzzle invariably brought him. By 6 o'clock we had quitted Baker Street and found ourselves rattling through the misty thoroughfares in a hansom. London, beneath the falling dark, glimmered with 1,000 blurred lamps reflected in puddles and shrouded in fog. At Queen Anne's Gate, we descended before a handsome row of townhouses, their facades stately and severe. Sir Edward Markham's residence was distinguished by the crest, identical to that upon the seal, which adorned its heavy oak door. The butler, a solemn fellow in livery, admitted us without hesitation as though our arrival had been foreseen. We were conducted to a richly appointed study, panelled in oak and lined with shelves of legal tomes. There, before the fire, stood Sir Edward himself, a man of perhaps 50 years, tall, broad-shouldered, with the heavy jowl and stern gaze of one long accustomed to command. Yet upon his face I perceived not authority, but a shadow of unease. "Mr. Holmes," he said gravely, extending a hand which trembled despite his effort to steady it, "I am indebted to you for attending. Matters are darker than even that letter conveyed." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray, Sir Edward, explain the circumstances. And if I may inquire, was it you who dispatched the summons?" At this the baronet started visibly, his eyes widening. "Summons? I sent no letter." Holmes and I exchanged a swift glance. The mystery had deepened at the very threshold. Sir Edward's denial hung in the air with such weight that even the crackle of the fire seemed subdued. Holmes, who had taken a place beside the writing desk, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, though his manner remained perfectly composed. I could see the tension in Sir Edward's hands as they opened and closed with an agitation that betrayed the depth of his disquiet. For a long moment, Holmes allowed the silence to press upon us, as though he were weighing its significance more than the words just spoken. At length he remarked in that precise and level tone of his that the denial was most enlightening, for it rendered the affair infinitely more complex. He asked whether Sir Edward had any knowledge of who might employ his seal and his name in such a summons. The baronet sank heavily into a chair, pressing his fingers to his temple before replying that the crest upon the seal was kept in his study under lock, and only he and his secretary had access. Yet he swore upon his honour that the seal remained in his possession and had not been tampered with. Holmes immediately requested to see it. A small iron key was drawn from Sir Edward's waistcoat, and he unlocked a narrow drawer within the desk, producing the object, a heavy, well-crafted stamp in silver, engraved with the falcon crown. Holmes took it in his long fingers and examined it minutely under the lamplight, noting the sharpness of the impression and the faint traces of red wax which corresponded precisely with that upon the letter we had received. It was clear the two were kin, though whether this particular stamp had been employed remained uncertain. The baronet declared with visible unease that no message of summons had left his hand, nor had he any cause to seek Holmes's counsel, at least until the present hour. This last remark caught Holmes's attention at once, for it implied that though Sir Edward had not sent the letter, he nonetheless had reason now to require an investigator. With a sudden turn of energy, Holmes urged the man to speak plainly. Sir Edward rose, paced before the fire, and then, with a voice lowered as though fearful of eavesdroppers, confessed that he had been in receipt of other communications, delivered in the same inexplicable fashion, though their tone was far more sinister than the polite summons that had reached Baker Street. At this revelation, my pulse quickened. Holmes bade him show us the letters, and Sir Edward, after some hesitation, produced a bundle from a locked box. The papers were unaddressed, each sealed with the same device, and within them were brief, chilling messages written in that same elegant hand. They spoke of secrets known, debts unpaid, and an approaching reckoning should Sir Edward fail to comply with unnamed demands. The earliest was dated a fortnight past, yet Sir Edward swore that none had ever been delivered by ordinary means. They appeared, as ours had, upon his desk, or upon a table in his chamber, without servant or visitor to account for them. Holmes examined each with meticulous care, his eyes scanning the strokes of ink, his nostrils flaring slightly as though scenting the faintest trace of some hidden clue. He remarked that the paper was of a costly make, sold only by certain stationers in Bond Street, and that the handwriting, while elegant, bore subtle disguises intended to obscure the writer's natural hand. He requested a list of those who might bear ill will toward the baronet, or who might profit by his distress. Sir Edward's features clouded, and it was plain he was reluctant, yet under Holmes's steady gaze he yielded. There were, he said, 3 possibilities: a former business partner by the name of Charles Forsyth, who had been ruined by a failed investment scheme years ago, a distant cousin, Henry Markham, who nursed resentment over an inheritance dispute, and lastly, a dismissed servant, a footman discharged for theft the previous spring. Holmes listened without comment, merely noting the names. I ventured to ask whether Sir Edward had sought the aid of Scotland Yard. The baronet shook his head, insisting that no formal accusation could be made without exposing himself to ridicule. For who would credit tales of letters that arrived by no hand? Moreover, he feared the scandal of his name in the papers should any hint of blackmail reach the public. Holmes inclined his head gravely, acknowledging the man's predicament. Then, with sudden sharpness, he asked whether Sir Edward had observed anything amiss in his household: unlocked doors, displaced objects, or strangers lingering near the premises. The baronet confessed that twice he had thought to hear footsteps in the corridor at night, though upon investigation he found nothing. Once a candle in his study had guttered as if by draught, though the windows were shut. These occurrences he had attributed to imagination, until the appearance of the letters made him reconsider. Holmes paced slowly about the chamber, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the carpet as though it concealed an answer. At last he turned abruptly and asked to see the servants. The baronet demurred, saying that the hour was late, and most had retired, but Holmes insisted that at least the secretary be summoned. A young man soon entered, thin and pale, with spectacles perched upon his nose. He was introduced as Mr. Alfred Kersey, secretary to Sir Edward for the past 5 years. Holmes engaged him in a brief but pointed exchange, asking about his duties, his access to the seal, and whether he had ever observed the mysterious letters before. Kersey replied in a quiet voice that his tasks were largely clerical, that he handled the seal only when directed, and that he knew nothing of the threatening notes until this evening. His manner was deferential, yet there was a curious rigidity in his bearing which I could not help but remark. Holmes's eyes, however, betrayed no hint of suspicion. He merely thanked the man and dismissed him. When we were alone once more, Sir Edward pressed Holmes urgently to advise him. Holmes, with that air of detachment which so often masked the quick movement of his mind, replied that there were too many uncertainties to hazard an immediate course. He requested permission to inspect the house, particularly the study and the chamber where the letters had been found. Though clearly wearied, Sir Edward agreed, and by lamplight we were conducted through the silent corridors. Holmes examined every surface with his lens, peering at locks, hinges, and carpets, noting faint scratches upon a desk, the smudge of a footprint upon the sill, and even the displacement of a volume upon the shelf. He said little, yet I perceived that each trifling observation was stored in that extraordinary mind of his. At length, having satisfied himself, Holmes declared that we must return to Baker Street and reflect. He assured Sir Edward that he would devote himself to the matter, and he instructed him to carry on his routine as though nothing had occurred. The baronet, though far from reassured, thanked him with evident relief. As we took our leave, I observed Holmes glance once more at the heavy door and its lock, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. The cab bore us swiftly away through the fog-laden streets. I could not restrain my impatience and pressed Holmes for his opinion. He smiled faintly and told me that we stood at the threshold of a most curious problem, one in which the method of delivery was of greater consequence than the message itself. When I protested that the threats surely took precedence, he shook his head, remarking that words upon paper may be composed by any man, but to place them where no hand was seen, that was the true marvel, and therein lay the heart of the enigma. He said no more, but sat in thoughtful silence until we regained Baker Street. There, as he removed his coat and settled into his chair, he turned to me with eyes gleaming. "Watson," he said, "we are in the presence of a mind most subtle and most daring. We must tread carefully, for the game has only just begun." The fire in our Baker Street sitting room had long since settled into a dull glow when Holmes, having sat for an hour in unbroken meditation, at last stirred and drew the letter once more from his pocket. He laid it flat upon the table, placed beside it one of Sir Edward's earlier threats, and leaned forward with that hawk-like keenness which I had learned to associate with the scent of discovery. The contrast between the two sheets was slight, but Holmes pointed with the tip of his finger to the pressure marks where the pen had dug into the fibers of the paper. The strokes, though graceful, betrayed the same small hesitation at the turn of certain letters. It was, he declared, the hand of one writer, however much they attempted to alter their style. I examined the marks with my own eyes, though I confess I saw little more than an elegant script. Still, Holmes's certainty left me in no doubt. He then took up his magnifying lens and inspected the paper itself. In the margin, invisible to my untrained sight, He showed me a faint crease as though the sheet had been folded once and then smoothed again. That fold, he insisted, was made not for posting but for concealment, perhaps slipped inside a book or hidden beneath some article until the moment of its placement. The absence of dust upon the crease suggested recent handling, not the lingering of an old letter carelessly preserved. Every small detail was, in his mind, a link in a chain. I inquired whether he believed the secretary, Mr. Kersey, to be implicated. Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the wood. He admitted that the young man's stiffness and nervousness might suggest guilt, but equally it might be the natural discomfort of an innocent clerk subjected to scrutiny. More telling, Holmes observed, was the fact that Kersey's spectacles bore a faint smudge upon the right lens, betraying that he had recently bent over a candle and allowed the smoke to touch the glass. Yet there had been no candle in the study when we saw him, nor could I imagine why such a trifle held weight. Holmes, however, appeared to file it away for later use. When I pressed for his immediate theory, he smiled and shook his head. "Patience, Watson. To rush to judgment is the common failing of lesser minds. Let us consider not the men, but the method. How does a letter appear upon a desk or table without passage through door or window? The locks were intact, the windows barred, and the servants accounted for. Yet appear it did again and again. Is it delivered by stealth, or does some more ingenious contrivance lie behind it?" I could provide no answer, though I confessed that I felt as though the business skirted upon the supernatural. Holmes laughed softly, his eyes gleaming. "You, my dear fellow, are too apt to credit shadows with agency. There is always a hand, though it may be invisible to others. Our task is to make it visible." The following morning he set about his inquiries with renewed vigor. He dispatched me with a note to a Bond Street stationer, inquiring into the sale of the particular paper and envelopes. The proprietor recalled only a small number of purchasers, chiefly gentlemen of means, and promised to supply a list of names. Meanwhile, Holmes himself vanished into the fog, returning only in the late afternoon with his boots muddied and his cloak damp. When I asked his errand, he merely replied that he had been following the falcon's flight, and that the bird had alighted in curious quarters. He refused further explanation, and I could only wait in mounting curiosity. That evening, as we sat once more by the fire, a visitor was announced, none other than Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. His sharp features betrayed both suspicion and curiosity as he entered. He greeted Holmes curtly, and upon being offered a chair, launched at once into complaint. Word had reached him of letters and threats at the Markham residence, and he accused Holmes of withholding information from the Yard. Holmes, unperturbed, replied that the matter had not yet ripened to the stage of official interference, but that Lestrade's arrival was in truth most opportune. Holmes laid the letters before him, and the inspector examined them with a frown. He declared them to be the work of some mischief-maker, intent upon extorting money, and suggested that the dismissed servant, the footman, was the likeliest culprit. He was known to be dissolute, and had been seen loitering in Westminster of late. "A warrant could easily be secured." I saw Holmes's lips twitch in faint amusement. "Your theory, Lestrade, is simple, direct, and as usual quite insufficient. You rely upon motive alone without considering means. How, pray, could this footman deposit a letter upon a locked desk without leaving trace of entry?" Lestrade dismissed this as trifling. A skilled thief, he said, could manage such things. Holmes leaned back and allowed the inspector to vent his certainty, but when at last Lestrade departed, Holmes turned to me with a look of sardonic triumph. "He has walked into the trap of the obvious, Watson, and such traps are the most perilous." The next day brought the promised list from the stationer. Holmes scanned it quickly, his eyes alighting upon one name in particular, Charles Forsyth, the very business partner whom Sir Edward had named among his enemies. Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully, remarking that coincidence was a phenomenon he distrusted. Still, he would not yet speak of conclusions. That afternoon we were once more summoned to Queen Anne's Gate. Sir Edward received us with a face grown more haggard. Another letter had appeared, he told us, this time upon the very pillow of his bed as he slept. The effect upon him was profound, for it suggested that his unseen adversary could enter even his most private chamber. He produced the missive, its message darker than before, a final warning to yield to demands, though still couched in vague terms. Holmes questioned him closely about the hours of the night, who slept near, and whether the door had been locked. Sir Edward insisted that he had secured the chamber himself, yet awoke to find the letter beside his head. At this, Holmes's eyes grew distant as though piecing together fragments of an unseen design. He asked to see the bed, the chamber, and every article within. With minute care he inspected the locks, the hearth, even the chimney, and measured the distance between the window and the neighbouring roof. At last he took up the pillow itself and examined its case with his glass. When he emerged from his scrutiny, his expression was one of concealed satisfaction. He said nothing, however, and merely requested that Sir Edward continue as if nothing had occurred. As we returned homeward, I could no longer contain my impatience. "Surely, Holmes, you have seen something." He regarded me with that infuriating mixture of affection and superiority which he often displayed. "My dear Watson, I have seen much, yet it is the pattern of what I have not seen that interests me most. Consider, the letter upon the desk, upon the table, upon the pillow, all placed with exquisite care, all without trace of intrusion. What does that suggest to you?" I could only shake my head in frustration. Holmes smiled faintly. "It suggests to me that we are dealing not merely with a man of cunning, but with one who has access, lawful or unlawful, to the very heart of the household. That night he was restless, pacing the floor, smoking incessantly, and jotting notes upon scraps of paper. Once I saw him draw a diagram of the house, marking points of entry and movement, before tearing it into pieces and casting it into the fire. His mood was at once elated and brooding, as though he stood on the threshold of revelation yet could not cross. He muttered of mirrors and shadows, of hands unseen yet present, of the falcon stooping unseen from the sky. I could glean nothing, and at length retired to bed with my curiosity unassuaged. In the morning Holmes was gone, leaving only a note upon the mantel. "I pursue the falcon. Do not follow." He returned hours later, flushed with triumph, carrying beneath his arm a small parcel. He would not disclose its contents, but I glimpsed within the wrappings the corner of some mechanical device. He locked it away at once, declaring only that the case was moving toward its climax and that our next visit to Queen Anne's Gate would prove most instructive. I pressed him further, but he silenced me with a finger raised. "Trust me, Watson. All will be clear soon. Until then, we must let the unseen hand play its next card, and so, though baffled as ever, I could not help but feel that Holmes had drawn nearer to the truth, and that the veil which cloaked the mystery was beginning, however faintly, to part. The following morning brought with it a fog so thick that the lamps glowed like smudged stars against the pale curtain of mist. Holmes, whose spirit seemed sharpened by the very obscurity that rendered London a labyrinth, declared that the day was admirably suited to investigation. He had already penned a note to Sir Edward, assuring him that we should pursue every line of inquiry with discretion, and now turned his full attention to the question of Forsyth, the ruined partner, whose name had emerged from both the baronet's lips and the stationer's ledger. It was, in Holmes's view, an inevitable starting point. We set out shortly after breakfast, the cab carrying us eastward into a quarter of the city that bore little resemblance to the stately avenues of Queen Anne's Gate. The houses were mean, the shops narrow and ill-kept, and the people, wrapped against the damp chill, moved with the furtive air of those who knew adversity too well. At length the cab drew up before a lodging-house of dismal aspect. Here, said Holmes, resided Charles Forsyth. The landlady, a sharp-featured woman, was reluctant at first, but Holmes, with his easy authority, soon secured admission. We were conducted to a small chamber on the upper floor, where a man of middle years sat hunched over a writing table. He rose as we entered, and I saw at once the marks of decline upon him. His hair was streaked with grey, his cheeks hollow, and his coat worn at the seams. Yet his eyes were quick and searching, and they lit with a strange mixture of pride and bitterness as he greeted Holmes by name. "You come about, Sir Edward," he said at once, his voice harsh with long-harboured grievance. Holmes admitted as much, explaining that certain communications had been received which touched upon the baronet. Forsyth gave a mirthless laugh. "Communications? I should think the man has reason to tremble, though not by my hand. Let him remember how he ruined me. But mark this, I do not skulk in shadows, nor do I stoop to anonymous threats. If I sought redress, it would be in open court, not by whispered menace." Holmes regarded him steadily, then produced one of the letters. "Does this hand resemble yours, Mr. Forsyth?" The man examined it with contempt. "If you imagine that I would waste fine Bond Street paper upon Sir Edward, you credit me with more wealth than I possess." "No, Mr. Holmes, my quarrel is plain and public. I despise the man, but I am no blackmailer." There was a sincerity in his words that impressed even me, though I had entered the room prepared to suspect. Holmes asked a few more questions, probing into Forsyth's movements over the past weeks, and received answers precise and verifiable. The man had spent most days laboring as a copyist for a firm of solicitors, a miserable occupation, but one that kept him under observation in their office. His evenings were his own, yet the idea that he could have penetrated a locked chamber in Queen Anne's Gate seemed incongruous with the worn and weary figure before us. Holmes thanked him courteously and withdrew. As we stepped into the foggy street once more, I expressed my view that Forsyth's innocence was evident. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Innocent of the letter, perhaps. But never discard a man too swiftly, Watson. Hatred can take many forms, and poverty may sharpen invention. Still, I confess he does not bear the air of one who orchestrates such delicately contrived alarms. Our next call was of an altogether different nature. The dismissed servant, a footman named Pritchard, had lately been seen near Westminster, and Holmes had traced him to a public house of ill repute. There we found him, a burly fellow with the coarse features of one too long acquainted with drink. When Holmes inquired into the letters, the man swore vehemently that he knew nothing of them. He admitted he bore resentment toward Sir Edward, but he lacked both the wit and the subtlety for such work. Indeed, the very coarseness of his denial seemed to prove his incapacity. Holmes dismissed him with a warning, though I saw he attached little weight to the fellow. By late afternoon we were once more at Baker Street. Holmes paced the carpet with restless energy, turning the problem over in his mind. Forsyth, with his motive yet lacking means. Pritchard, with neither wit nor refinement. Henry Markham, the cousin, remained untested, and Holmes resolved that we must next direct our attention there. Before that, however, he produced from the drawer the parcel he had acquired on his secret errand. Unwrapping it with care, he revealed a small device of ingenious construction, a spring mechanism attached to a narrow rod which could, when compressed, propel a folded paper some distance. With a flick of his hand he demonstrated, sending a note sailing across the room to land upon the mantel. "You see, Watson," he exclaimed, "a letter may indeed be delivered by no hand, at least none visible to the recipient." I marveled at the contrivance, though I confessed myself puzzled how it might apply. Holmes explained that such a device could be concealed within furniture, a wall, or even the lining of a box. When triggered, the letter would emerge at the appointed place. It was but a theory, he admitted, yet it offered a natural explanation for the otherwise inexplicable. To discover whether such a mechanism was employed in Sir Edward's house, we must search with greater care. The following evening found us once more at Queen Anne's Gate. Holmes requested that Sir Edward allow him to examine not only the study, but also the bedchamber where the last letter had appeared. With lantern in hand, Holmes scrutinized every seam of the furniture, tapping the panels and pressing at hidden joints. At length his persistence was rewarded. Behind a panel of the writing desk, he found a narrow cavity cunningly fashioned, within which a small spring device lay concealed. It was empty now, but the marks of wax and the faint trace of paper fibers betrayed its recent use. Sir Edward was aghast, swearing that he had never seen such a thing. Holmes, his eyes alight with triumph, declared that the mystery was a step nearer resolution. The letters had not passed through walls by sorcery, but had been delivered by mechanism. The question now was, who had placed the device within the furniture? Sir Edward protested that the desk had stood in his study for years, untouched, save by himself and his secretary. At the mention of Kersey, Holmes grew thoughtful. He asked when the secretary had first entered the household. 5 years past, came the reply. Long enough, Holmes murmured. Long enough indeed. Sir Edward grew pale, insisting that Kersey was loyal and trustworthy. Yet Holmes merely bowed, remarking that loyalty is best proven by scrutiny. He requested that the secretary attend them on the morrow, for certain documents must be examined in his presence. As we departed, Sir Edward clutched Holmes by the arm, begging him to speak plainly. Holmes only replied that the net was drawing close, and that within a few days the hand that guided the falcon would reveal itself. We drove away through the mist, my mind a-whirl with questions. Holmes, however, leaned back in silence, his thin lips curved in a smile that told me he was nearer than ever to the truth. That night, as I recorded the events in my notebook, I could not help but reflect upon the curious chain that had brought us here. The impossible letters, the ruined partner, the dismissed servant, the cousin yet unseen, all circling round Sir Edward like dark birds in the fog, and in the centre Holmes, tireless and unfathomable, drawing each thread tighter until the web would at last be laid bare. Holmes's insistence that the secretary attend upon us the following morning weighed heavily upon Sir Edward, who could scarcely conceal his agitation. I too felt the stirrings of suspicion, though I dared not voice them, lest they prove baseless and injurious to an innocent man. That night at Baker Street, Holmes smoked pipe after pipe, pacing with a restless intensity that betrayed the activity of his thoughts. At intervals he would pause, jot a symbol upon a scrap of paper, and then thrust it into the fire as though fearful that even I might glean too much. When at last he spoke, it was only to remark that a falcon stoops swiftly when prey has grown heedless, and that we must be prepared for the strike. He would not elaborate, and I went to bed with my mind unsettled. The morning brought us once more to Queen Anne's Gate, where we were received by a visibly shaken Sir Edward. His secretary, Mr. Kersey, awaited us in the study, his manner outwardly composed, though the pallor of his face suggested unease. Holmes greeted him with civility and set him at once to the task of bringing forth certain ledgers and correspondence. As Kersey bent to his work, Holmes's eyes travelled with hawk-like precision over every motion, the way his fingers lingered upon the desk, the glance he cast at the panel where the device had been hidden, the tremor that passed through him when Holmes, in an apparently idle gesture, tapped the very place with his knuckle. I perceived all this dimly, but Holmes, I knew, missed nothing. While the secretary arranged the papers, Holmes engaged him in casual talk. He asked of his background, of his education, of his habits of reading. Kersey answered readily enough, though I thought his replies curiously rehearsed, as though he had anticipated each inquiry. Holmes, without comment, turned his attention to the documents, examining signatures, seals, and marginal notes with scrupulous care. At one point, he asked Kersey to fetch a particular ledger from an upper shelf. As the young man reached for it, Holmes's gaze darted swiftly to his pocket, where the faint outline of some object showed beneath the fabric. He said nothing, but his lips pressed together in a thin line. When the examination was concluded, Holmes thanked the secretary and dismissed him. As the door closed, Holmes turned to Sir Edward and myself with a quiet satisfaction. "We have seen enough," said he, "though the game is not yet ready for the final move. There is a consistency in all these letters which speaks more loudly than their words, but I will not spoil the harmony by revealing it prematurely. Let us say only that the hand which wrote them is nearer to us than either of you yet imagine." Sir Edward started violently, but Holmes raised a hand for silence. "Fear not, Sir Edward. The truth will out, and soon. For the present, I advise that you continue your routine and that Mr. Kersey remain undisturbed. Indeed, it may prove profitable that he believe himself unsuspected." As we departed, I pressed Holmes for an explanation. "You have observed something decisive," I said, "and yet you withhold it even from me." He smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming. "My dear Watson, your pen is too faithful. Were I to disclose prematurely, you would record it, and thus the tale would lose its savour. Be patient. All hinges upon a single inconsistency, as glaring to my eyes as the sun at noon, yet invisible to others. When the moment is ripe, you shall know." The days that followed were marked by a tense expectancy. Holmes was abroad for long hours, returning at odd times with dust upon his coat and an air of secret triumph. Once he showed me a slip of paper bearing figures, which he described as the key to a cipher. Another time he carried a small box from which protruded the corner of yet another mechanism, though he refused to let me examine it. His secrecy, though vexing, only heightened my conviction that he had grasped the thread which bound the mystery together. Then, on the third evening, a fresh development occurred. A messenger arrived at Baker Street bearing a note, not from the mysterious hand but from Sir Edward himself. In agitated script, he implored Holmes to come at once, for a new letter had appeared, this time upon the dining table in full view of the household, though none had witnessed its arrival. Holmes read the note with calm interest, then turned to me. "The net tightens, Watson. Tonight we shall see whether the falcon has flown too near the light. too near the light. At Queen Anne's Gate we found Sir Edward pale and distraught. The letter lay upon the table, its message more menacing than before. "Yield it, commanded, or ruin shall consume you." The baronet wrung his hands in despair, declaring that his very sanity was threatened. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated. He examined the sheet minutely, then held it to the lamp, revealing faint impressions of another text upon the reverse, as though the paper had been pressed against a page of notes. He asked Sir Edward whether the secretary kept journals. The baronet confirmed that Kersey was in the habit of recording accounts in a private notebook. Holmes's eyes flashed, though he only remarked that journals are most instructive documents. When Kersey entered, summoned by Sir Edward, Holmes engaged him in conversation about the letter, feigning ignorance of its appearance. Kersey protested astonishment, yet there was a stiffness in his manner that betrayed strain. Holmes watched him intently, then inquired after his notebook. The secretary flushed, hesitated, and at last produced a small volume from his coat. Holmes turned its pages with apparent carelessness, yet his gaze was sharp. At length he closed it, handed it back, and dismissed the man. The moment the door shut, Holmes turned to Sir Edward with quiet triumph. "The matter is clear, though the final proof must yet be secured. That notebook, my dear Watson, is the key. Did you observe the indentations upon the fresh letter? They correspond precisely with the figures and lines in the secretary's journal. In short, he pressed his notes against the sheet when writing, and left the ghost of his hand upon the paper. It is a blunder, but a decisive one." I gasped at the implication, but Holmes raised his hand. "Not a word yet, Watson. Our adversary is subtle, and if he suspects exposure, he may act with desperation. We must be ready." To Sir Edward he said only that he should guard himself carefully, admit no strangers, and trust Holmes to act when the time was ripe. As we returned through the fog, I could scarcely contain my excitement. "You have him, Holmes. Why not arrest him at once?" Holmes shook his head with a smile. "Arrest, my dear fellow, is the blunt weapon of the yard. I prefer the rapier. Let him weave his web a little further. The more he spins, the tighter he will be ensnared. Besides, there is one detail yet unresolved, one thread whose position must be fixed before the design is complete. When that is done, the falcon shall fall." I pressed no further, for I knew his mind was immovable, yet I marveled at the composure with which he bore his knowledge, holding in silence the clue that to him was decisive, while to me it remained but a mystery of shadows. And so I understood that Holmes, with the secret clue firmly in hand, was already shaping the trap that would draw our adversary into the light. The following day dawned with a pall of mist that clung to the streets like a shroud. I found Holmes at the window, his lean figure silhouetted against the pale glow of morning, his eyes fixed upon the bustling yet muted movement of Baker Street below. He had scarcely touched his breakfast, and I knew at once that the case had entered some new phase within his restless mind. When I ventured to speak of the secretary and the damning imprint upon the paper, Holmes turned with a quick flash of his keen eyes and shook his head. "The matter is not yet finished, Watson. We possess a clue of great weight, but the play is unfinished. If we move now, we may frighten our quarry into flight before the trap is properly sprung. The falcon must stoop of its own accord." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing another urgent note from Sir Edward. His handwriting trembled across the page. A theft had occurred in the night, jewels from a casket within his wife's chamber, though Lady Markham herself was absent visiting relatives in the north. The servants swore the doors had remained locked, yet the jewels were gone, and in their place, upon the silken lining of the empty box, lay another of the infernal letters. Its words were more terrible than before. "Yield your secret, or next it shall be your life." I watched Holmes as he read. His face betrayed no surprise, though I observed the tightening of his lips. "Another crime," he murmured. "The stakes are raised. Our adversary grows bold, and boldness is the mask of desperation. Come, Watson, there is no time to lose." We hastened at once to Queen Anne's Gate. The household was in turmoil, the maids whispering fearfully, the butler stiff with indignation at the violation of his trust. Sir Edward met us in his study, pale and drawn, the letter trembling in his hand. Holmes took it without a word, examined it minutely, then inspected the jewel casket with his glass. The lock showed no marks of tampering, yet the interior bore faint scratches, as though some implement had been employed. He turned to Sir Edward. "Who knew of these jewels?" The baronet replied that only Lady Markham and himself, with Kersey aware by virtue of his clerical duties. Holmes nodded slowly, then requested to see the secretary at once. Kersey entered, his expression controlled but uneasy. Holmes held up the letter. "Another gift from our unseen hand. Tell me, Mr. Kersey, where were you last night?" The young man replied that he had been at his lodgings in Westminster, working late upon accounts. Holmes pressed him upon the details, but he maintained his composure, offering to produce his notes as proof. Holmes waved this aside, remarking that proof is best left to the proper occasion. For now, he merely asked Kersey to fetch from the library certain volumes, and as the secretary departed, Holmes's eyes gleamed with that quiet certainty that I knew so well. When we were alone, Holmes said in a low tone, "You perceive the pattern, Watson? First letters, then theft, next what remains? Violence. Our adversary escalates. We must close the net swiftly. Yet there is still one thread unfastened, and until I grasp it, the picture will not be complete." I inquired what thread he meant, but he would only reply, "The cousin, Henry Markham. We have heard his name, but not his voice. Let us seek it out." That afternoon we journeyed to a club in Pall Mall, where Henry Markham was known to frequent. We found him there, a younger man than Sir Edward, though with a family likeness about the brow and eyes. His manner was genial, his speech frank, and he welcomed us readily when Holmes introduced himself. When questioned about his relations with Sir Edward, he admitted to past disputes over inheritance, but declared that he bore no malice. He had, he said, prospered in business, and had no need to envy his cousin's wealth. His alibi for the night of the theft was solid, corroborated by several acquaintances at the club. Holmes listened intently, then rose, offering thanks, and we withdrew. Once outside, I remarked that the cousin, too, seemed free of suspicion. Holmes smiled thinly. "Appearances may mislead, but in this case, I'm inclined to believe him." "No, Watson." The shadow falls closer to Sir Edward's hearth. We returned to Baker Street as dusk gathered. Holmes was silent, absorbed in thought, until suddenly he sprang up, seized his violin, and drew from it a long, low note. As the sound quivered in the air, he said, "It is almost complete, Watson. Tonight I shall set the final test. The falcon shall strike and we shall be ready." Before I could press him further, a knock came at the door. It was Lestrade, bearing grim news. A watchman had been found senseless near Queen Anne's Gate, struck down by an unknown assailant. He lived, but could give no clear account of his attacker. Lestrade suspected prowlers and hinted that Forsyth might be responsible. Holmes listened with apparent indifference, then said only, "You may arrest whom you please, Lestrade, but mark my words, the hand you seek lies already within the Markham household." Lestrade scoffed, but Holmes's confidence remained unshaken. As night fell, Holmes laid his plan before me. We would return to Queen Anne's Gate and lie in wait. He had contrived with Sir Edward to leave certain drawers unlocked, and within them he had placed slips of paper as bait. If our adversary sought once more to deliver a letter unseen, he would be compelled to act, and Holmes intended to be present when he did. The hours passed in tense silence, the great house cloaked in shadow. Holmes and I concealed ourselves in the study, a single lamp burning low. Midnight came, then 1, then 2. At last there was a faint sound, the almost inaudible creak of a board. Holmes's hand gripped my arm. Through the dim light we saw the door ease open, and a figure glide within. It was the secretary, Alfred Kersey. He moved with stealth, approaching the desk, and from his pocket drew forth a folded paper. With a practiced motion he pressed a hidden spring, and the letter slid neatly into place upon the surface. In an instant, Holmes was upon him, seizing his wrist with an iron grip. Caught! Kersey let out a strangled cry, and the paper fluttered to the floor. Sir Edward rushed in, summoned by our signal, his face white with shock as he beheld his trusted secretary in the act of betrayal. Kersey struggled, then sagged in defeat. His lips moved as though to speak, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. All in good time. The game is not yet played out. Holmes turned to Sir Edward. You see, the hand that placed the letters was no phantom. It was one within your household, a man who enjoyed your confidence and thus your vulnerability. Yet let us not press him now. Tomorrow he shall speak, and the tale he tells will astonish you. With Kersey secured under Lestrade's custody, we departed. Holmes, as we rattled through the silent streets, seemed curiously subdued. He had achieved his aim, yet his face was grave. "The matter is not ended, Watson," he said softly. "There is a deeper current beneath these letters, a motive not yet revealed. Until that motive is laid bare, the case is but half complete. We have caught the falcon, yes, but what prey was he commanded to strike? That remains to be seen." I looked at him in wonder, for if to my eyes the secretary's guilt was plain, to Holmes the puzzle had grown still more intricate. And so I understood that the rising stakes had not yet reached their climax, and that the true heart of the mystery lay hidden still in shadow, waiting for Holmes's unerring hand to draw it into the light. Holmes's resolve that the case had not yet reached its end puzzled me deeply, for to my mind the secretary's guilt had been established beyond all doubt. I had seen him with my own eyes slip the letter into the desk, and his subsequent capture under Holmes's hand seemed proof enough of his treachery. Yet Holmes, though satisfied in one sense, bore a gravity that told me he believed some deeper force was still at play. He spent the better part of the next day in seclusion, smoking incessantly, scribbling on scraps of paper, and at intervals pacing the floor with restless energy. He muttered often of the falcon, of prey unseen, of hands that guided other hands. By evening he announced with abrupt decision that the time had come for a stratagem. "Watson," said he, "we have the instrument, but we have not yet uncovered the composer. Kersey is but a player, trained and compelled, perhaps tempted, to perform his part. Who then holds the baton? That is the question. To answer it, we must stage a performance of our own." He dispatched me with notes to both Lestrade and Sir Edward. Lestrade was to hold Kersey under the pretence of custody, but not to press him with questions. Sir Edward was to behave as though nothing had occurred, and above all to speak freely before his cousin, should the opportunity arise. Holmes himself then set about the business of disguise, donning a suit of clothes that transformed him into a shabby clerk, with stooped shoulders, a false beard, and ink stains upon his fingers. When I expressed surprise, he explained that he must move unseen within the world of stationers and scriveners, for there he believed lay the origin of both the paper and the scheme. For 3 days he vanished into the fog, leaving me to make daily visits to Sir Edward, who grew ever more anxious as rumours of scandal began to stir in society. On the 3rd night Holmes returned, weary but triumphant. He flung down upon the table a sheaf of papers, all bearing the same watermark as the threatening letters. "I traced their origin," he declared, "to a small printer's shop near Charing Cross. There I learned that a gentleman, well-dressed and of commanding presence, purchased them in bulk not 2 months past. He gave no name, but his description matched one you have already heard. Henry Markham." I was astonished. "The cousin? But we found him amiable, alibied, above suspicion." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Amiable, yes. Alibied, so he claims. But above suspicion? Never. Remember, Watson, the most dangerous mask is that of geniality. Yet I do not say that Henry penned the letters with his own hand. No, he is too cautious for that. He required an intermediary, someone within the house, someone pliable like Kersey. His plan, Holmes explained, was to pit Kersey's loyalty to Sir Edward against the temptation of gain, perhaps with threats added to persuasion. Thus the secretary became the instrument, planting the letters with the aid of the contrivances hidden in desk and bed. The theft of Lady Markham's jewels was but another act, designed to terrify Sir Edward into yielding. But yield to what? That, Holmes said, was the final veil. To tear it away, we must draw Henry Markham into the open, and to do that, we shall use the bait of Sir Edward's supposed capitulation. The next evening, we met with Sir Edward in strictest confidence. Holmes instructed him to pen a short note as though in desperation, stating that he was prepared to yield his secret and to meet his adversary at midnight in the abandoned chambers of an old legal society near Lincoln's Inn. The words were to be left where the secretary, under covert surveillance, might discover them. In this way, Holmes predicted, the message would be conveyed to its true master. The plan was executed with precision. Sir Edward left the note upon his desk. Kersey, under guard but permitted movement, soon stumbled upon it. His face, observed by Lestrade through a concealed panel, betrayed both fear and resolve. He secreted the note in his coat, and that evening, under watch, he was seen to slip out into the fog. He made his way directly to a lodging-house known to be Henry Markham's haunt. There, through the gloom, Our men observed him deliver the note to the cousin himself. At once, Holmes set his counterplot in motion. Disguised as a night watchman, he and I stationed ourselves within the echoing chambers at Lincoln's Inn, the dust thick upon the floors, the air heavy with disuse. Midnight approached with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant chime of St. Clement's. Then footsteps sounded in the passage, steady, assured, not the uncertain tread of one fearful of exposure. Into the room stepped Henry Markham, tall and commanding, his eyes gleaming in the lantern's glow. He bore no weapon, but in his hand he carried a folded paper. He paused, scanning the chamber, and called softly for Sir Edward. At that moment Holmes struck a match and the sudden flare revealed us both. Markham started, then recovered swiftly, his lips curling in a smile. "So, Mr. Holmes, you are the phantom that dogs me." He made no move to flee, but stood with defiance. Holmes regarded him coolly. "You overreached, Mr. Markham. You thought to unseat your cousin by terror, to force him into surrender of that which you covet. The letters were clever, the mechanisms ingenious, but you placed too much faith in your instrument. Kersey was careless, and carelessness is fatal in such games." Markham's eyes darkened, but he remained silent. Holmes continued. "You sought to wrest from Sir Edward the deeds to certain estates in Kent, concealed from the public by a legal fiction of long standing. You feared exposure of your debts, and sought instead to secure inheritance before your time. The jewels you seized were but pressure, tokens to frighten him into compliance. All this I know and more, for I have in my pocket the record of your purchase of the very paper upon which these threats were penned." Markham laughed harshly. "You have no proof that will stand in court." Holmes's voice cut cold and precise. "On the contrary, I have the secretary, whose journal bears the very impressions of your threats. I have the printer, who will testify to your purchase. And I have yourself, caught here by appointment, lured by the bait of your own ambition. Proof enough, I think." At that instant, Lestrade and his men entered, seizing Markham before he could move. He struggled fiercely, but in vain. As they led him away, Holmes bent to retrieve the folded paper he had carried. It was blank, save for the seal of the Falcon. "A final attempt at theatre," Holmes murmured, "but the curtain has fallen." When we emerged into the cool night air, the fog had lifted, and the stars shone faintly above the roofs. Holmes, with the weariness that always followed triumph, walked in silence for some time. At last he said, "The Falcon is caged, Watson. But let us remember, men like Markham are not driven by need alone, but by vanity, by the conviction that their cleverness outstrips the world's. That arrogance is ever their downfall. Sir Edward is safe, though scarred by betrayal, and our task is done." Thus Holmes's stratagem, conceived in the solitude of Baker Street and played out in the shadows of Lincoln's Inn, brought the true architect of the mystery into the light, revealing the hand that guided all unseen. When the tumult of Markham's arrest had subsided, we returned with Sir Edward to the quiet of his study, where the fire glowed low and the shadows stretched long upon the panelled walls. The baronet, pale and shaken, pressed Holmes to explain the course of events. For though he had witnessed the capture of his cousin, the motives and the means remained dark to him. Holmes, with that air of calm precision which followed his greatest exertions, settled into a chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and began to unravel the tangled skein. "My dear Sir Edward," said he, "what you have endured these past weeks is the work of no spirit, no phantom hand, but of a most human ingenuity. Your cousin, Henry Markham, driven by debts and envy, sought to compel you into surrender of your hidden estates in Kent. He required leverage, an invisible pressure that would sap your confidence and bend your will. To achieve this, he enlisted the aid of one close to you, your secretary, Alfred Kersey. The young man, though outwardly dutiful, was of pliable nature and easily bent by promise of reward or threat of ruin. It was through him that the entire stratagem was played." Sir Edward stared aghast. "Kersey, my own secretary?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. It was he who planted the letters, he who concealed the mechanical contrivances within desk and bed, and he who delivered your jewels into Markham's keeping. But mark you, he did not act alone, nor did he conceive the plan. That belongs to Henry Markham, who, wary of soiling his own hands, directed the game from without." Holmes reached into his pocket and drew forth one of the letters, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. Observe, if you please, the elegance of the script. At first glance, it appears to be the work of a refined gentleman. Yet upon close examination, one perceives a peculiar hesitation at the curve of certain letters, an unnatural pause. Such hesitation arises when one copies another's hand, not when one writes freely. The impression upon the paper reveals the truth. The very indentations correspond to figures in Kersey's own journal. He pressed his notes against the sheet, leaving the ghost of his calculations upon the letter. That was the blunder which first betrayed him. I remembered then the faint lines Holmes had shown me beneath the lamp, and I marvelled at how he had drawn from them a chain that bound the secretary to the crime. But what of the manner of delivery, I asked. How could these letters appear upon locked desks and pillows without entry? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That, my dear Watson, was the heart of the illusion. A simple spring mechanism, hidden within furniture, propelled the letters into place. When triggered by pressure, or by subtle manipulation, the folded paper would emerge as though deposited by unseen hand. Ingenious, but not beyond the wit of a skilled mechanician. Kersey, at Markham's instruction, had contrived to conceal these devices within your chambers. Each letter that seemed to defy natural explanation was in truth the product of patient craft. Sir Edward groaned, covering his face with his hands. To think that all my torment was wrought by such contrivances. And my jewels? Holmes nodded gravely. A calculated step intended not for gain but for terror. The theft was meant to prove that no sanctuary was safe, that even the most guarded casket could be violated. In truth, it was but another device to break your spirit. Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. Consider the sequence. First, vague threats to unsettle your mind. Then the intrusion upon your privacy, to suggest omnipresence. Next, the theft, to inspire dread of ruin. And finally, had we not intervened, there would have been violence. The assault upon the watchman near your house was but rehearsal. The next stroke would have fallen nearer home. Sir Edward shuddered, and I confess that I too felt a chill. Yet Holmes, calm as ever, continued. What first fixed my suspicion upon Henry Markham was not the letters nor even the devices, but the paper itself. It was of a kind sold only by a certain printer near Charing Cross, and when I traced the purchase, I found it had been made in bulk by a man answering precisely to your cousin's description. That, coupled with his known resentment, made the conclusion inevitable. Still, I required proof, and proof I obtained when Kersey, under observation, carried your supposed capitulation straight into Markham's hands. The baronet, who had followed every word with growing amazement, sank back in his chair. And yet, he murmured, Henry bore himself with such geniality, such frankness when you met him. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. The mask of geniality, Sir Edward, is the most perilous of all. Your cousin believed himself cleverer than the world, and it is ever such arrogance that brings men low. He rose, pacing slowly before the hearth. You will recall, Watson, how Lestrade fastened at once upon the footman. That was the obvious suspect, and therefore the false one. Forsyth, too, with his public grievance, served as a convenient misdirection, but neither possessed the refinement, the patience, nor the motive to orchestrate so subtle a campaign. Only Henry, with his debts pressing and his eyes upon your estates, had both cause and cunning. Kersey was but the tool. I could not restrain my admiration. Holmes, I said, you have turned shadows into substance, impossibilities into proofs. But tell me, what would have happened had we not intervened? Holmes's face grew grave. Then, Watson, Sir Edward might even now be dead. Markham's scheme was escalating beyond his control. Desperation drives men to folly, and the line between intimidation and murder is perilously thin. Sir Edward grasped Holmes's hand, overcome with gratitude. You have saved my life, sir, and preserved my honor. How may I repay you? Holmes disengaged his hand with quiet modesty. By guarding your trust more carefully, Sir Edward. Betrayal often enters not through the gates, but by the key you yourself bestow. As for payment, the mere exercise of my faculties is reward enough. Later, as we left the house and made our way through the cool night air, I reflected aloud upon the strange ingenuity of the devices, the mechanical falcon that had seemed to deliver letters by no hand. Holmes gave a short laugh. It is the oldest of tricks, Watson. Make a man believe he beholds a marvel, and he ceases to question the commonplace. Sir Edward, overwhelmed by fear, accepted the impossible rather than seek the simple. Yet the world, I assure you, remains stubbornly within natural laws. We walked in silence for a time, the lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. At last Holmes spoke more softly. "There is a lesson here, Watson. Men are not undone by their enemies so often as by those in whom they place blind faith." The secretary, the cousin, both wore masks of loyalty, yet beneath them lay greed and envy. "Remember it, for the world is full of falcons cloaked as doves." When we reached Baker Street, Holmes flung himself into his chair, drew his violin to his chin, and began to play a low, haunting air. I listened, reflecting upon the peril we had witnessed and the brilliance with which he had unmasked it. And though the case was ended, I knew that for Holmes it was but another movement in the ceaseless symphony of crime and deduction which filled his life. The proceedings that followed Henry Markham's arrest unfolded with all the solemnity of a Victorian drama. Word spread quickly, for such scandals are the favoured nourishment of society, and whispers passed along club corridors and drawing rooms with greater speed than any telegraph. Sir Edward, though deeply shaken, bore himself with dignity, attending to his affairs while keeping from public notice the full extent of his cousin's treachery. Yet the truth could not be suppressed entirely, for Lestrade, eager to claim credit, ensured that the Yard's involvement was widely known. Holmes, with his habitual disdain for publicity, retreated to Baker Street, content to let the official record bear what form it might. In the days that followed, Kersey's confession was secured. Pressed with the weight of evidence and the certainty of Holmes's deductions, the young man broke down in tears and admitted his role. He spoke of how Henry Markham had approached him months before, insinuating knowledge of certain indiscretions in his past, small thefts from previous employment, debts he had incurred. Markham offered both money and the promise of protection in exchange for cooperation. At first, Kersey claimed, he resisted, but the threats grew more pointed, and his weakness of character rendered him pliant. Soon he was entangled in the scheme, setting devices within the furniture, placing letters under direction, and at last stealing the jewels to give weight to the terror. He swore that he had never intended harm, that he acted under duress, but Holmes, with his cold eye upon him, remarked only that weakness is itself a crime when it becomes the tool of villainy. Henry Markham, for his part, maintained a haughty silence. At his preliminary hearing he stood erect, denying nothing yet admitting nothing, a man convinced of his own superiority even in chains. Holmes, watching from the gallery, whispered to me that Markham's pride would prove his undoing, for juries are quick to despise arrogance. Indeed, the evidence against him was formidable. The stationer's testimony, the papers traced to his purchase, Kersey's confession, and the mechanical devices found within the house. Each formed a link in the chain, and together they bound him fast. Sir Edward, relieved though still wounded, visited us one evening to pour out his gratitude. He declared that but for Holmes he would have been ruined in mind and fortune, perhaps even in life. Holmes, however, brushed aside his thanks with a brusque gesture. "Gratitude, Sir Edward, is a coin too easily spent. Keep it, and spend instead vigilance upon those you trust, for trust once betrayed is seldom regained." The baronet took his leave, humbled yet wiser. While I marvelled again at Holmes's curious mixture of brilliance and austerity, his disdain for reward where others would have sought a claim. Yet even with the case ostensibly concluded, I sensed within Holmes a restless dissatisfaction. One evening, as we sat before the fire, I remarked upon it. "You have triumphed, Holmes. Why then this air of unease?" He smiled faintly, the shadows of the flames dancing upon his sharp features. "Because, Watson, triumph in such matters is never pure. A man may be convicted, another disgraced, yet the scars upon the innocent remain. Sir Edward will carry suspicion in his heart until his death. Every trusted face will remind him of betrayal. That is the true consequence of crime, and no court can redress it." His words lingered with me, for they bore a sombre truth. In my medical practice, I had seen the wounds of body heal, yet the wounds of trust fester unseen. Sir Edward had been saved from ruin, yet in another sense he was marked forever. As for Kersey, his fate was less severe than it might have been. His youth, his confession, and the evident domination exerted by Markham won him a measure of leniency. He was dismissed in disgrace, his career shattered, but spared the harshest penalty. I could not but feel some pity for him, a weak vessel tossed upon stronger currents, though Holmes regarded him with the cold eye he reserved for those who, through cowardice, abet greater crimes. In the weeks that followed, Life at Baker Street resumed its accustomed rhythm. Clients came and went. The papers brought fresh accounts of scandal and intrigue, and Holmes alternated between languid boredom and bursts of manic activity. Yet now and again he would speak of the Falcon, as he had christened the case, with a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The Falcon soared high, Watson, he once mused, but it was tethered by vanity. When the string was pulled, it fell. That is ever the fate of men who believe themselves masters of others' fears. One evening, as I closed my notebook upon the final entry of the affair, I reflected aloud that it was among the most curious of our adventures, the letter delivered by no hand, the phantom threats, the cunning devices. Holmes, who was stretched languidly upon the sofa with eyes half closed, gave a dry chuckle. Curious, yes, but not unique. There is always a hand, Watson, though it may be invisible to the untrained eye. The world loves to cloak its crimes in mystery, but strip away the veil and one finds always the same motives: envy, greed, vanity. The trappings may change, but the heart remains constant. I pressed him then upon what he regarded as the most instructive feature of the case. Without hesitation, he replied, "The instructive feature lies not in the contrivances, clever though they were, but in the psychology of fear." Sir Edward was so bewildered by the apparent impossibility that he ceased to question, and in that moment the scheme triumphed. Remember it, Watson, the surest way to deceive a man is to present him with a miracle. He will accept the impossible sooner than the improbable. His words seemed to me a fitting epitaph for the case, for indeed, what had begun as a riddle of letters appearing without agency had resolved into the most human of dramas, a cousin's envy, a servant's weakness, a gentleman's fear. And through it all, Holmes, with his cold reason and unerring eye, had pierced the veil, turning marvel into mechanism, suspicion into certainty. Thus the aftermath settled upon us. Markham to his fate in the courts, Kersey to obscurity, Sir Edward to a life forever touched by betrayal, and Holmes to his ceaseless vigil against the manifold deceits of men. And I as ever to my pen, striving to set down faithfully the triumphs and the burdens of my remarkable friend. The weeks slipped by with the inevitability of the turning seasons, and soon the case which had so consumed our days and haunted our nights passed into the realm of memory, though never without leaving behind its indelible mark. Holmes, restored to his customary languor, lounged in his armchair, his fingers steepled and his gaze half-lidded, as though the whole affair were already a closed volume, shelved among the countless chronicles of human folly. I, however, could not dismiss it so lightly. Whenever I set pen to paper to record the narrative, I felt again the chill of those uncanny letters, the hush of Sir Edward's haunted rooms, and the cold gleam in Henry Markham's eyes when the trap at Lincoln's Inn had sprung shut upon him. Markham's trial was swift, for the evidence marshalled by Holmes's deductions left little room for ambiguity. The jury, impressed by the clear sequence of proofs and disgusted by his imperious disdain, found him guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted extortion. He received a sentence that ensured his pride would find little sustenance in the confines of a cell. Kersey, by contrast, was spared the full severity of the law. His weakness rather than malice was recognized, though Holmes refused to extend him sympathy. "He will live out his days," Holmes remarked, "not as villain but as warning. A reed that bends to every wind may still pierce the hand that grasps it." Sir Edward attempted to restore his household to its former order, yet I sensed whenever we called upon him that a shadow lingered there. His gratitude toward Holmes was sincere, but his eyes betrayed a wariness that no reassurance could wholly dispel. A man who has discovered treachery at his elbow cannot readily resume the serenity of trust. Holmes observed this with a certain melancholy, though he voiced no reproach. To him it was but another illustration of what he termed the psychology of betrayal, more corrosive than theft, more lasting than violence. For my own part, I found myself reflecting often upon Holmes's method, the manner in which he seized upon the faintest thread, a crease in a paper, an indentation invisible to the common eye, and from it wove an unbreakable chain of reasoning. Where others saw impossibility, he discerned mechanism. Where others faltered before apparent marvels, he sought the commonplace. It was his genius to pierce the veil of mystery, not with flights of imagination, but with a relentless logic that reduced marvel to fact. And yet, beyond that logic, There was in him a profound understanding of the human heart, its vanities, its fears, its fatal weaknesses, which lent his deductions their uncanny certainty. One evening, as the smoke of his pipe curled upward, and I closed my notebook upon the final page of the case, I ventured to tell him that the affair of the letter delivered by no hand would, I thought, remain among the most memorable of all our adventures. He looked at me with that sardonic twinkle which so often accompanied his deeper reflections. "You magnify, Watson. To me it was but another example of the eternal duel between cunning and reason. Markham believed that by clothing his scheme in the garments of the impossible, he could escape scrutiny. Yet the impossible, once accepted, blinds men to the improbable. And it is the improbable, Watson, that most often conceals the truth." I reminded him of the peril Sir Edward had faced, of the jewels stolen, of the night when Kersey was caught placing the letter upon the desk. Surely, I urged, even he must admit that this case possessed a singular flavor. He gave a thin smile. "Singular, yes, in its dress, but not in its essence. The same forces ever drive men: envy, greed, ambition. The falcon may have flown in strange circles, but its hunger was the oldest of hungers." Thereafter he relapsed into silence, drawing his bow across the strings of his violin in a slow, haunting phrase that seemed to echo the melancholy of his words. I watched him as the firelight flickered across his lean features, and I knew that though he downplayed his triumph, within him burned the quiet satisfaction of a mind that had once again wrested order from chaos. The fog deepened outside, muffling the clamour of London, and I reflected that the world would never cease to supply him with puzzles. Somewhere, even as we sat in that familiar room, another web of deception was being spun, another falcon poised to stoop. And when it did, Holmes would rise with his cold reason and unfailing eye, to strip it of its feathers and reveal the hand beneath. Thus ended the case of the letter delivered by no hand, leaving in its wake a trail of ruined pride, broken trust, and one more chapter in the annals of Sherlock Holmes. For myself, I remain, as ever, astonished at his powers, humbled by his detachment, and grateful that I, at least, may bear witness to the brilliance which he himself so persistently disclaims. And though he will never admit it, there is in him a quiet satisfaction whenever a puzzle yields, a flicker of triumph in those keen grey eyes. Before the veil of indifference falls once more, the affair of the letter delivered by no hand concluded, as so many of our adventures did, not with fanfare but with the quiet restoration of order. Henry Markham faced justice, stripped of his pretence and grandeur, and Alfred Kersey, the pliant tool of his schemes, was dismissed into obscurity, his weakness more pitied than punished. Sir Edward, though saved from ruin, bore henceforth the subtle wound of betrayal, and in his eyes one might always discern the shadow of suspicion where once there had been trust. Such scars, as Holmes observed, are not easily erased. One evening, some weeks later, as the last reports of the case faded from the newspapers, I found Holmes in his chair by the fire, his violin resting idly across his knee. I remarked that this adventure, with its phantom letters and mechanical marvels, was unlike any we had encountered, and surely deserved to be remembered among his greatest triumphs. He gave a faint, sardonic smile. "My dear Watson," said he, "the world is ever eager to dress its crimes in the garments of the marvellous. But beneath the cloak lies always the same body: envy, greed, ambition. Strip away the trappings, and you will find that this so-called mystery was but another tale of human vanity. I protested that no ordinary man could have unravelled its web, that only his unerring eye had pierced the veil." He shook his head with a kind of weary amusement. "I merely looked where others would not, Watson. The crease of a paper, the hesitation of a pen, the ghost of a figure pressed into the fibres. Trifles, perhaps. Yet trifles are the hinges upon which great doors turn." He fell silent then, drawing the bow across the strings in a low, meditative chord, and I watched the flicker of firelight upon his sharp features. To him the case was already relegated to the archive of memory, another puzzle solved, another falcon brought down from the sky. To me it was a reminder of the singular genius at whose side I had the privilege to stand, a man who transformed impossibility into clarity, and who in so doing restored to a troubled world its fragile sense of order. And so the tale closes, not with the roar of scandal nor the clang of triumph, but with the quiet notes of Holmes's violin drifting into the London night, and with my enduring wonder at the brilliance of the friend whose greatness he himself would never admit.